H1. The Mute Girl's Voice. Eleanor Wright hadn't spoken a word since the fire that killed her parents when she was 7 years old. Now at 13, standing on the docks of Liverpool in 1847, she clutched a piece of slate and chalk, her only tools for communication, and wondered if survival was worth the effort it required. The workhouse had finally released her. Not from kindness, but because she'd reached an age where she could work, and feeding useless mouths wasn't economically sensible. They'd given her one dress, threadbare and too small, and pointed her toward the docks. "Find work or starve," the matron had said. "Makes no difference to us which." Eleanor couldn't speak, but she could hear perfectly. She heard the matron's contempt. She heard other children whisper that she was cursed, that the fire had stolen her voice as punishment for some sin. She heard the world dismiss her as broken, defective, worthless. But Eleanor had learned something in 8 years of silence. People underestimate those who cannot speak. They assume muteness means stupidity. They talk freely around those they believe cannot participate. They reveal things they'd never tell someone who could repeat their words. Eleanor had listened, and listening, she'd learned. On the docks, she approached a fishmonger named Mrs. Patricia Brennan, who ran a small stall selling mackerel and herring. The woman was shouting prices, arms waving dramatically, her Irish accent thick enough to cut. When she paused for breath, Eleanor held up her slate with words carefully written. "I will work for food only, 1-month trial. If useless, dismiss me." Mrs. Brennan squinted at the slate, then at Eleanor. "Can't speak?" Eleanor shook her head. "Can you gut fish?" Eleanor nodded, though she'd never gutted a fish in her life. She'd figure it out or starve trying. "Right then. 1 month. But I'm warning you, girl, this work's brutal. Your hands will be raw within a week." Eleanor's hands were raw within 2 days. The fish scales cut like tiny knives. The salt burned her wounds. The smell soaked into her skin and hair until she could taste it constantly. But she didn't quit. She watched Mrs. Brennan's technique, learned to gut fish with speed and precision, and discovered she had steady hands and unusual focus. But more importantly, Eleanor listened. The docks were full of talk, merchants discussing shipments, sailors sharing news from distant ports, traders arguing prices. And because Eleanor couldn't speak, they ignored her. She became part of the scenery, no more notable than the crates and barrels stacked everywhere. She heard a ship's captain mention that herring catches had collapsed in the North Sea. She heard a merchant complaining that mackerel prices were rising in Manchester. She heard traders discuss how railway expansion was changing fish distribution. Towns that had never seen fresh fish suddenly had access, creating new markets. Eleanor absorbed it all. And within 2 months, she understood something Mrs. Brennan didn't. The fish trade was changing rapidly, and those who adapted would thrive, while those who stayed traditional would struggle. One evening, Eleanor wrote on her slate and showed it to Mrs. Brennan. "Railway reaches Manchester next month. Fresh fish in 6 hours instead of 3 days. We should sell there instead of here." Mrs. Brennan laughed. "Girl, I've been selling fish on these docks for 20 years. What do you know about it?" Eleanor wrote again. "Here you compete with 40 sellers. Same fish, same customers. Manchester has none. You'd be first. Could charge double. Can't just go to Manchester. Who'd run this stall?" Question. Close it. Move permanently. Start new. Mrs. Brennan stopped laughing. Eleanor nodded. Something in that determined nod made Mrs. Brennan reconsider. The girl was right. Competition on the docks was brutal. Most days barely covered costs. Manchester was a gamble. But staying here guaranteed slow starvation. If I do this insane thing, you're coming with me. I'll need help. And you've proven you're not afraid of work. 3 weeks later, they arrived in Manchester with 2 barrels of salted fish, no contacts, no customers, and rapidly diminishing funds. Mrs. Brennan rented a small market stall and prayed they wouldn't starve. Eleanor had a different plan. She'd spent the journey observing, listening, learning. Manchester was exploding with textile mills and factories. Thousands of workers needed feeding. But fresh fish? None available. The city ate what could survive long transport: salted meat, preserved goods, nothing fresh. On their second day, Eleanor approached a mill supervisor during his workers' lunch break. She held up her slate. Fresh fish, delivered weekly, cheaper than butcher, healthier workers. The supervisor read it skeptically. "We feed 200 workers daily. Can you supply that volume?" Eleanor wrote, "Yes, trial batch free. You like it? We negotiate price." That free batch, which cost them precious capital they couldn't afford to lose, created 5 standing orders by week's end. Other mills heard about fresh fish and wanted the same. Within a month, Mrs. Brennan was receiving orders faster than they could fill them. But Eleanor saw the next problem clearly. They couldn't scale. 2 women couldn't supply Manchester's growing demand. They needed more fish, faster delivery, reliable suppliers. Eleanor took her slate to the railway station and found the freight manager. She wrote, "Liverpool fish to Manchester. Daily shipments. Guaranteed volume." "Who's paying for this freight?" the manager asked. "I am," Eleanor wrote. "But I don't have money yet. I need credit for 3 months. Then I pay double." The manager laughed her out of his office. Eleanor went back the next day, and the next, and the next, each time with her slate, each time calmly persistent. On the 5th day, the manager's curiosity overcame his dismissal. "Why should I trust a mute girl who owns nothing?" Eleanor wrote slowly, clearly. "Because I've done something you haven't. I've created demand where none existed. Manchester mills want fresh fish. I supply them. Business is growing faster than I can handle. You help me scale, you profit from every shipment forever. You refuse, someone else will eventually see this opportunity and you'll have missed it." Something in her written confidence convinced him. Or perhaps he was just bored and curious. 3 months credit. But if you default, I'll make sure every business in Manchester knows you're not trustworthy. Eleanor nodded acceptance. With railway credit secured, Eleanor expanded aggressively. She contracted with Liverpool fishermen directly, cutting out middlemen. She negotiated bulk pricing with mill supervisors. She recruited other women to help with processing. Within 6 months, what had started as Mrs. Brennan's small operation had become Wright and Brennan Fish Supply, providing fresh fish to 20 Manchester mills and several hotels. Mrs. Brennan handled the actual fish operations. Eleanor, despite her silence, handled everything else: contracts, negotiations, expansion strategy. She wrote everything on her slate. and people learned that when Eleanor Wright wrote something, she meant it and would deliver it. By 1850, at 16 years old, Eleanor was managing a business that generated £300 monthly in revenue. The mute workhouse girl who'd arrived in Liverpool with nothing now had employees, accounts, and respect from businessmen twice her age. But Eleanor's greatest innovation came from understanding her own limitation. She couldn't speak in person, which meant she couldn't handle impromptu negotiations or emergency situations. So she did something unusual. She hired someone who could. Margaret Davies was a widow with 3 children, desperate for work. Eleanor offered her a position as speaking agent. Margaret would speak Eleanor's written words in negotiations, handle verbal communication with clients, represent the business in situations where speech was required. This partnership, one woman who thought brilliantly but couldn't speak, another who spoke well but needed direction, worked spectacularly. They complemented each other's strengths and covered each other's weaknesses. By 1855, Wright and Brennan fish supply had expanded beyond Manchester into Leeds, Sheffield, and Birmingham. They employed 40 people across 4 cities. Annual profits exceeded £2,000. Eleanor, at 21, was one of the few women in England running a substantial business. She'd also developed an unexpected talent: written communication. Because Eleanor could never speak casually or impulsively, every word she wrote was considered carefully. Her business letters became known for clarity and precision. Clients joked that Eleanor's written instructions were clearer than most people's speeches. But success created enemies. Competitors, angry at losing market share to a woman, a mute woman, began spreading rumors. They claimed Wright and Brennan sold spoiled fish. They bribed health inspectors to examine her shipments with extra scrutiny. They undercut her prices with predatory pricing, accepting short-term losses to drive her out of business. Eleanor faced her greatest crisis in 1857. A shipment of fish spoiled during transport. Genuinely spoiled. Not sabotage. Just bad luck with railway delays during a heat wave. 20 mills received bad fish. Workers got sick. The scandal threatened to destroy everything she'd built. Eleanor could have made excuses, blamed the railway, deflected responsibility. Instead, she wrote letters, personal, handwritten letters, to every affected mill supervisor. The message was simple: I failed you. The fault is mine. I will refund triple your payment. If you'll allow it, I'll spend the next month personally overseeing every shipment to rebuild your trust. If not, I understand. I'm sorry. 19 of 20 supervisors gave her a second chance. Not because of the refund, though that helped, but because Eleanor's written accountability impressed them. In an era when businessmen routinely dodged responsibility, her directness was radical. She spent that month working brutally hard, personally inspecting every fish shipment, implementing new quality controls, creating redundant systems to prevent future failures. The business survived, stronger and more reliable than before. By 1860, at 26, Eleanor decided to expand into something new, teaching other women to run businesses. She'd noticed that many women had business intelligence, but lacked the confidence or knowledge to act on it. Eleanor created a small school where she taught bookkeeping, negotiation, contract law, all the practical skills she'd learned through necessity. The school was unusual. Students learned by doing. Eleanor gave them real business problems from her own operations, let them propose solutions, then implemented the good ones. Several students eventually started their own businesses. One became a successful textile merchant. Another opened a bakery chain. When Eleanor Wright died in 1891 at 57 years old, she'd never spoken a single word since age 7. But she'd communicated more effectively than most people who spoke constantly. Her business had created employment for hundreds. Her school had educated 73 women in practical business skills. Her written legacy, thousands of carefully crafted letters and documents, showed that silence didn't mean absence of voice. At her funeral, Margaret Davies, her partner of 40 years, read a letter Eleanor had written years earlier, to be opened after her death. "I was 7 when fire took my voice. For years, I believed silence made me less than others. I was wrong. Silence made me listen when others spoke carelessly. It made me think before communicating. It made me write with precision that speech rarely achieves. The world called me broken, but I wasn't broken. I was different, and different, used well, becomes advantage. I hope I've shown that limitation, accepted and adapted to, transforms into strength. That what seems like weakness can become your greatest tool. That the world's judgment of you matters less than your judgment of yourself. I couldn't speak, but I built a voice from slate and chalk and careful written words. And that voice, quiet as it was, carried farther than shouting ever could." Eleanor Wright's story proves that communication isn't about volume, it's about clarity. That disability doesn't define capability. That the world's assumptions about your limitations matter less than your refusal to accept those assumptions. The mute girl, who supposedly had no voice, became one of the clearest communicators of her generation. Not despite her silence, but because of it. She couldn't speak, so she learned to write with precision that speech rarely achieves. She couldn't negotiate verbally, so she built partnerships that compensated for her limitation. She couldn't shout to be heard, so she created written communication so clear it needed no volume. And in doing so, Eleanor Wright proves something profound. Your limitation is only permanent if you accept it as defining. She couldn't change her muteness, but she could change what muteness meant. And that choice, between accepting the world's verdict or redefining the terms, made all the difference. The fire took her voice at 7. But Eleanor Wright spent the next 50 years proving that voice and speech aren't the same thing. That you can communicate powerfully without speaking. That silence, channeled properly, speaks louder than noise. She built her fortune and legacy, one written word at a time. One carefully chosen phrase, one precisely crafted sentence. And those written words, quiet as they were, changed hundreds of lives and built an empire from absolutely nothing. Not bad for a girl the world assumed had nothing to say.